Hi, this is Chris with LaunchCode, and we are now ready to prepare our application to connect to a MySQL database. So this video is just going to do some of the initial setup steps that we need before we can go in and start writing code to connect to our database. So the first thing I need to do in order to connect my coding events application to a database is to have a database and user that can be connected to and can be used while connecting. So I'm going to open MySQL Workbench. And I already have MySQL running, so when I try to connect to my local instance on port 3306, I will successfully connect. If you get an error doing that, make sure your database is running. Okay, the first thing I want to do is to create a new database or a new schema. So I'm going to go over to the Schemas tab. Up here in the toolbar, this left-hand icon with a little, sort of looks like a couple of cylinders, that's the new schema icon. So I'll click on that, and this just gives me a window to configure my new schema, and I'm going to name this after my application. So the best practice for development is to have one database and one user per application. So if I have 5 applications I'm working on my machine, I should have 5 different databases, one for each application, and each of those databases should have their own user, and that's just really for the purposes of data integrity and data security. So I'm going to call this coding_events in accordance with that convention. And I'll hit the apply button at the bottom right. It's going to give me a preview of the actual SQL query that will be run, which looks good. So I'll hit apply on that. And that was successful. So on the left-hand side, I can see now that I have a coding events schema. Okay. Now I have a database, and I want to be able to connect to the database, and I need to do that with a user. So I'm going to go to the administration pane to create a new user specifically for connecting to this database. And I'll click on Users and Privileges under the Management section of the administration pane. Okay, and I can go at the bottom left, there's an Add Account button, which is what I want to do. So I want to add account, and now I need to configure this account. So the login name, you can sort of choose this as you like, but I typically make it the exact same as the database or schema name, just for convenience. And under limit hosts to matching, we're only going to use this for development on our local machines. So the percentage sign is a wildcard in MySQL. We're only going to use this user to connect on our local machines. So I'm going to put localhost as the limit to hosts. And then under password, we need to add something as a password that's reasonable. This is just going to be for development, so you don't have to create a super secure password. ABC123 probably isn't great, but you don't need to work too hard to get something. So I'm going to do learn with the capital L, the number 2, code with an exclamation point. Okay, so just to reiterate, let me pull up a little window here and show you what I just typed since it's hidden. So the password I just used was learn2code. Okay, and once again, generally, if you're going to be using a database on production or in an active environment where others can connect to it, you definitely need a strong password. For development, it's a little bit less important. Okay, and let's see. That looks good. There's one more thing I need to do, which is I need to give this user permission to access the coding events database that I just created. So I'm going to go to the far right tab, Schema Privileges here. And underneath this might be kind of, the UI here can be a little bit odd if your screen's a little small, but there should be a button that says Add Entry. If not, you might need to enlarge your window. But I click on Add Entry, and this will allow me to select the schema that I want to give this user access to. And so I'm going to say that I want to select the coding events schema. That's the one I want to give my new user permissions to access. And I'll hit OK, but we're not done yet. I need to, below, select the specific privileges on that schema my user should have. And so I'm going to select all. Okay, so just once again, we selected that we want our coding events user to have access to the coding events schema, and then we want to have all of the base privileges available for that user, so that user can basically do whatever they like. And I'll hit apply. And we should be good. So with that, our database and user are set up to use. I'll close out of this window here, and then I'll go back to IntelliJ. So there's one more thing we need to do before we start coding, and that's to configure IntelliJ, or not IntelliJ, configure Spring Boot to connect to that specific database. And so there's a couple of things we need to do that. So the first thing I want to do is go to my Gradle file. So to connect to a database, you're going to need specific dependencies or specific packages that will support that database connection. And in our case, we're going to be using MySQL, and we're going to be using some additional libraries, in particular JPA and Hibernate, which we'll talk about later, to connect. And so I need to make sure that those dependencies are included in my application. So down in the dependencies block, just below the other implementation dependencies, I'm going to create some space here and actually have a document with these saved. This isn't something you necessarily need to remember, so I just have a doc saved with the things that I need. So I'll copy them one at a time so I can tell you about them as I paste them in. This implementation dependency is org.springframework.boot, and the specific package within that org is Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. This is going to contain the object relational mapping code that will allow essentially object to relational database translation. And so that's going to be something we talk about for several video lessons after this. But it's essentially doing the work of taking your Java objects and breaking them down and putting them into a relational database. And this code is generally agnostic of the specific database you're connecting to. So you could have it connect to like a Mongo database or, say, a Postgres database. We, however, are going to be connecting to a MySQL database. So we need a MySQL specific driver. And so I have one of those as well. Again, copy from my doc. And this particular, notice when you copy paste, sometimes your quotes might get messed up. There we go. So this dependency is MySQL : MySQL connector Java. This is going to pull in the appropriate version of the MySQL driver that allows Spring Boot to connect to a MySQL database. Okay, so those are the two new dependencies I need. I'll close my Gradle file. And now I need to configure the specific settings for my database. So we're going to go into application.properties. I told you about this file in one of the very first videos on Spring Boot, and we haven't had an occasion to really use it yet. But we do now for sure, and we're going to use it quite a lot going forward. So open up application.properties. This file allows you to set specific properties for the running of your application. And so Spring Boot will read this file when it starts up. So let me go to my note here, and I have the properties that I already want. Again, this is not the kind of stuff you need to memorize necessarily, so it's okay to have a little note and copy and paste. So I'm going to go in here and copy that contents and put it into my application.properties file. And let's see, let me explain line by line the settings that we just put in here. These first three are the specific connection settings that we need. So the first one is the URL that Spring Boot needs to use to connect to our database. It's essentially saying, hey, where is the database? And so this URL, it might not look like a URL you're used to, but it is indeed a URL. It's first saying that we're going to use JDBC to connect. JDBC is the sort of lower level Java API. Java Database Connectivity, I believe, is the acronym. And that's the lower level Java API that's used to connect to databases. And most other object relational mapping systems are built on top of JDBC. And let's see, MySQL, that's obvious. We're going to connect to a MySQL database, // This is the host we're connecting on, so we're connecting to the database on our local machine. It's on localhost at port 3306. And then / the path here is going to be the name of the schema or database that we want to connect to. Okay, so that's essentially saying, where is the database that I want to connect to? The next line is spring.datasource.username. This is, again, the username that we're using to connect. That username, of course, needs permissions on that database, and then the password is below. So one note on passwords, it's not a great practice to put passwords explicitly in plain text in a file, especially when you're committing that file to version control. In this case, we're going to sort of wave our hands at that because this is a password we're only using on our local machine. So even if I did put this specific password into GitHub, nobody would be able to access my database because only someone on my laptop can access it. We'll put a note in the lesson materials about how to more securely store database passwords and the like when you're going to put that code out on an actual server that people might be able to access. Okay. The next setting is telling Spring Boot the type of database we're using. This is MySQL. This is case sensitive, so make sure you get that all caps. Down below is a setting that's currently set to false, which is the default setting, but we're going to set it to true from time to time just to see what's going on. This is a setting, spring.jpa.show-SQL. This is what some people call query logging, and this setting will when enabled, it will spit out the queries that our application is generating when it talks to MySQL. So in our application code, we're not going to actually write SQL queries. We're not going to sit inside of a Java code and write, say, a select statement or an insert statement. What we are going to do is we're going to configure our application such that it can generate those queries for us. But from time to time, it'll be really useful just to see what those queries are and just to be able to look at those. So if we turn on this setting, if we set it to true, that will turn on query logging, and each query that our application runs against our database will be logged to the console output. This next setting is something we'll talk about a little bit more in the next video, spring.jpa.hibernate.ddl-auto. So this setting, sort of in a nutshell, the way you should think of this is this tells Hibernate whether or not to create or update the tables in our database. And we'll see exactly what this does in the next video once we configure our model classes. But essentially, Spring Boot is able to intelligently look at our model classes and see the different classes and the different fields within those classes, and from that determine what the tables are that we need in our database, and if they're not there, it'll create them for us. So for now, we're going to leave this at update. There might be times where we want to change this, but I'll explicitly show you how this setting allows Spring Boot to create and update our schemas when the application starts up based on our model classes. And then finally, the bottom line, spring.jpa.properties.hibernate.dialect. That's a mouthful. This is the setting that essentially tells Hibernate, which is our object relational mapping library. It tells it which version or which flavor of MySQL to use. We're using MySQL 8, so this is using the org.hibernate.dialect.mysql8dialect. This is just the name of a class that'll be used to specifically create or generate MySQL code that is compatible with MySQL 8. All right, so those are all the settings you need to set up and configure your database or your application to connect to a MySQL database. The next video will show you how to actually configure your model classes so that they can be stored in that database.